Mexico has just taken a step that no Latin American country has taken in the modern era, and the consequences of that step are far larger than most people realize. For the first time in recent history, Mexico has begun enforcing its immigration law against United States citizens in a visible, public, and deliberate way, not as a warning, not as a diplomatic message hidden in fine print, but as an action carried out on the ground with buses, detention orders, and border crossings that cannot be ignored. American citizens were detained inside Mexican territory, placed on buses operated by Mexican immigration authorities, transported to the border, and returned to the United States for one simple reason. They were living in Mexico without valid immigration status. This was done using the same legal logic, the same administrative process, and the same justification that the United States has applied to millions of Mexican nationals over decades. No special category, no informal tolerance, no exception based on nationality. This is not a protest. It is not symbolic. It is enforcement. And if you are not paying close attention to what is unfolding right now along the U.S. Mexico border, you may soon find yourself asking how this happened so quickly and why almost no one explained what it truly means. Because what is happening is not just about migration, it is about reciprocity, and reciprocity once applied alters power relationships in ways that are very difficult to reverse. On the morning of January 13, 2026, just before 7, 3 buses operated by Mexico's national migration authorities crossed the international bridge from Tijuana into San Diego. On board were 147 United States citizens detained over the previous weekend. Their violation was not complex or disputed. They were living in Mexico without valid immigration documents. Some had been there for months, others for years. Some owned small businesses. Some were retirees living on fixed incomes. None had the required legal status. For decades, situations like this existed in a gray zone. Hundreds of thousands of Americans lived in Mexico on tourist permits that expired every 6 months. When those permits ran out, many simply crossed the border, turned around, and re-entered to reset the clock. The practice became routine. Mexican authorities were aware of it. Enforcement was minimal. The system tolerated it quietly. That tolerance no longer exists. Mexico has decided that its immigration law will be applied without nationality-based exceptions. The passport you hold no longer determines whether the law is enforced. The law itself does. This decision did not emerge out of nowhere. It came after years of imbalance and a series of recent events that forced a reassessment inside Mexico's government. Earlier this month, the United States dramatically expanded deportations from its own territory. These removals included not only undocumented migrants, but also legal residents with minor offenses and people who had lived most of their lives in American communities. Within days, tens of thousands were deported. Families were separated. Longtime residents were removed from homes they had occupied for decades. Mexico protested diplomatically, describing the measures as excessive and destabilizing. Those protests were dismissed. At that point, Mexican officials began questioning an assumption that had guided policy for years. That restraint would be reciprocated. It wasn't. And once that assumption collapsed, the logic of continued tolerance collapsed with it. Behind the headlines lies a legal reality that is difficult to challenge. Every sovereign nation has the right to determine who may live within its borders. This principle underpins international law. It is the same principle Washington invokes every time it enforces its own immigration system. Mexico did not create a new rule. It applied an existing one reciprocally. That reciprocity is what unsettled Washington. According to Mexican government estimates, roughly 1 and 2 million U.S. citizens currently live in Mexico. Of those, somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 may lack valid immigration status. That is not a marginal number. These individuals live in places like San Miguel de Allende, Puerto Vallarta Play, Carmen de Riviera, Maya, Los Cabos, La Chapala, Mérida, Oaxaca, and Guanajuato. Many have lived there for years, some for decades. Many own property. Many operate businesses. Many depend on remaining in Mexico to maintain a standard of living they could not afford in the United States. For a long time, enforcement against this population was minimal. That imbalance is now gone. Publicly, Washington reacted with anger. Travel alerts were issued. Statements were made. Economic retaliation was threatened. Privately, the tone was far more cautious because inside the U.S. government, officials understand something that is rarely stated openly. Mexico holds leverage, and not symbolic leverage, but structural leverage. Mexico controls the most heavily trafficked border in the world. More than 1 million people cross it legally every single day. Even minor changes in inspection procedures, documentation checks, or administrative enforcement can produce immediate effects. Delays ripple into supply chains. Trade slows. Economic pressure builds within days. No dramatic escalation is required. Mexico is also the United States' largest trading partner. Bilateral trade exceeds $800 billion annually. American manufacturing depends on Mexican components across the automotive, electronics, medical, and industrial sectors. These are not abstract connections. They are logistical realities. Disruptions show up in factory schedules, inventories, and prices very quickly. Then there is migration control itself. For decades, Mexico has functioned as the primary barrier preventing large-scale migration from Central America, South America, and the Caribbean from reaching the U.S. border. Mexican authorities intercept, detain, and deport hundreds of thousands of migrants every year. This work dramatically reduces pressure on U.S. border infrastructure. It is rarely acknowledged publicly, but it is essential to the system's stability. There is also the issue of American retirees. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens live in Mexico because pensions and Social Security payments stretch far further there than they do in Arizona, Florida, or California. Housing, healthcare, and daily expenses are significantly lower. If large numbers were forced to return suddenly, the financial and social impact on U.S. systems would be immediate. And finally, there is tourism. More than 30 million Americans visit Mexico every year. Entire regional economies depend on that flow. Visa reciprocity alone would reduce it sharply. Again, no escalation is needed, only symmetry. This is why the response from Washington, despite public anger, has been cautious. Mexico does not need to threaten. It only needs to enforce. That is what makes this moment different. Power is no longer theoretical. It is operational. This shift is not abstract. It affects real people. A retired American living near Lake Chapala receives a notice giving 30 days to regularize immigration status or face removal. The visa process takes longer than that, and thousands are now applying at once. A family in Arizona crosses the border every weekend to support relatives deported under expanded U.S. enforcement and watches the news with a growing realization that the system they supported is now operating in reverse. Inside government offices in Washington, career officials face a reality they have never had to explain before. Another country has the legal right to deport U.S. citizens, and there is little they can do about it. Across Latin America, reactions have been measured but revealing. Governments have emphasized sovereignty, equality under the law, and the right of states to control their borders. There has been no broad condemnation. That silence matters. It signals understanding. Globally, the message is clear. Double standards are harder to maintain when enforcement becomes symmetrical. This is not an immigration crisis. It is a recalibration of power. For decades, migration functioned as a one-way instrument of enforcement. That era may be ending. What replaces it is not chaos, but balance. In the coming weeks, enforcement will likely intensify in areas with high concentrations of U.S. citizens living without proper documentation. Negotiations will follow because negotiations always follow. But one thing cannot be undone. The precedent has been set. The assumption that U.S. citizens are informally exempt from foreign immigration law has collapsed. And when assumptions collapse, systems adjust. This moment will be studied far beyond Mexico and the United States. It demonstrates something fundamental about how power works in the modern world. Reciprocity is power, and power once exercised calmly, legally, and without spectacle, tends to redefine relationships in ways that rhetoric never could. This is not the end of cooperation, but it is the end of asymmetry.